Prime Minister, great to see you.
One of Brian Mulroney's oldest opponents, but Jean Chrétien revealed shouting across the political divide was years behind them.
We will tease each other. You will poke fun at me, I will poke fun at him. And, we will, as I say, we have to not to take ourselves too seriously. We have to take the job very seriously. We tend, when we talk privately like that, to talk about memories that we share. And as I said earlier, we have many coming from rural Quebec.
Not just home for them, but a key part in Mulroney's big bet in coming to power.
His greatest success was to break in Quebec. And it was his argument when he ran, and it turned out to be right.
Prime Minister Trudeau, who saw Mulroney last summer at one of his last public events, also praised him and noted how he has relied on his advice far past when Mulroney held office.
He was incredibly generous and effective in advising me and our government on the renegotiation of NAFTA during some very challenging years, where not just the advice and strategic counsel he gave me and us, but also active with his contacts as part of Team Canada to make sure that the messages on how important the friendship and the relationship between Canada and the U.S. was, not just for Canada but the U.S., was key.
Mulroney also nurtured personal relationships, like with former Quebec Premier Jean Charest, who just visited him in Florida this weekend.
He was very weak, but already at that time he said to me, I'm not sure I'm going to finish the year. And I tried to convince him of the contrary, telling him, listen, this is the 40th anniversary of the election of his government. And that he had in front of him a number of events that we needed to organize to celebrate his legacy.
And from the Conservatives' current leader,
the lesson I take from Brian Mulroney is to always remember humble beginnings. He started as the son of an electrician in a working-class Baie-Comeau neighborhood. He worked like crazy to get himself a good education and pay his way through law school. But no matter how high he rose in politics, he remembered those humble beginnings. He remembered the struggle of his parents to put food on the table.
That legacy's importance echoed by Trudeau.
He shaped our past, but he shapes our present, and he will impact our future as well.
Rafi Boudjikanian, CBC News, Ottawa.
Former Prime Minister Stephen Harper is also remembering Brian Mulroney. He wrote, "History will record that Mr. Mulroney's premiership was transformational. Canada has lost a historic figure, and we mourn his passing with all his many friends and associates." We saw Jean Chrétien in Rafi's story, elected in the Tories' landslide victory in 1984. Chrétien went on to serve in Mulroney's cabinet. He later led the Progressive Conservative Party himself and served as the Premier of Quebec. And Jean Chrétien joins us from Montreal tonight. Jean, thank you for speaking to us on this
Thank you, Ian.
Difficult night for so many people. I want you to take us back to when you were a young cabinet minister working alongside Brian Mulroney. What was he like at that point in his career?
I was elected in '84. I was 26 years old. I had supported Joe Clark in the leadership race. And so the Mulroney clan and the nomination, they weren't favorable to my candidacy, but I got through. And then we got to know each other, and he took me under his wing. And I became a minister at a very young age. And I remember Ian very fondly that moment, because he asked me where my wife was, and he said to me, I would have never been Prime Minister of Canada without Mila. And I remember the gesture. He said, we're like this. And he asked me where my dad was, and because he had lost his dad at a very young age. And he was an extraordinary person in that respect. As a leader of a party, I don't think there's anyone who has reached the pinnacle that he reached as a leader of a party. As a prime minister, he was courageous, transformational for the country. And he lived in a period where he felt that governments and leaders had to make difficult decisions that were sometimes unpopular, carry them, defend them, and if you got the politics right, you would get through them. So he changed our country. He changed our lives. And those who served with him, all those who served with him, remember him very fondly.
And people, Jean, who may be too young to remember or maybe have not thought about it very much over the last few decades, tell us a bit about Mulroney's strength as a leader, because he created this coalition that included Conservatives from Quebec and from the West and ended up with that huge majority in the first election win.
His basic argument in the leadership race against Mr. Clark in 1983 was, are you tired of losing? And we as a party need to be able to have support in Quebec, and I can deliver that. He delivered that in spades. He reached out to Quebec. The Meech Lake Accords were done for Canada, not just for Quebec. I mean, this perception, it was done for all of Canada because he felt we needed to fix this if we were going to go forward. And so in that respect, he was exceptional. And then as a party leader, he reached out to all of the country. You know, it was interesting, Ian, you'd go to a caucus meeting and at the end of the mandate, I mean, we had been through a lot of difficult issues. Country was a bit worn out by all the debates. And when he was in caucus, when he spoke to caucus, everyone would show up. That's how compelling he was. We'd walk out of that room, we were at 15% in the polls, and the media thought, they looked at us, they thought they must be on drugs. It's as though they're on 60% of the polls. But that's how powerful he was as a leader. And that allowed him to get a lot of things done. So in that respect, those who worked with him will forever remember an exceptional and a very generous man.
We have about a minute left. Of course, by the end of his time in politics, he left a depleted Conservative Party. You were part of that, just 2 seats in the House of Commons, and then you ended up becoming the leader of that party. I don't know what connection he had to you then, but as you look back at the highs and the lows of the Mulroney Conservatives, what would you say his legacy is?
Well, he did change the party. He had a very activist agenda and very transformational. And when he left power, admittedly, the government in the country was partly worn out. When I became leader of the party, he was very supportive of everything we did. I saw him last Saturday, and I had, I went to Florida because he wanted to chat, and I saw him Saturday. And we talked about preparing events to celebrate his legacy of the last, because this is the 40th anniversary. And so I hope that'll happen this year, because there's a lot of good things to remember about Brian Mulroney and what he's done for us and what he's done for our country.
Jean Chrétien, a real pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian.
Well, let's bring in former CBC News chief correspondent and host of The National, Peter Mansbridge, who covered Brian Mulroney over the years many times. And Peter, first of all, some reflections on the former Prime Minister's passing.
Well, we knew that his health had been a challenge for him these last couple of years. The last time I was back and forth with him was just a couple of months ago. And, he knew the difficulties he was facing, but he was convinced that he was going to power through. But unfortunately, these health issues took his time away from him today. Listen, he's a major figure on the Canadian political landscape. Was he without failures in his political life? No, not at all. I mean, there were some issues that haunted him a long time. But there were other things that put him on that landscape in a significant way. I mean, 2 majority governments, there are not a lot of prime ministers who can say they got 2 back-to-back majority governments, including the biggest one in Canadian history in 1984. He pushed through free trade. There was a divisive debate, but I think most people, not all, but most people argued that it helped establish Canada on an economic front in a different way, given the free trade successes. The GST was something that was a problem in terms of selling it, but at the same time, it was something that future governments were greatly thankful for, including the Liberal government that followed the Mulroney era. But I think most significantly for him was on the world stage, was his pushing for South Africa and Nelson Mandela. He pushed Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan into accepting the idea of Mandela being released from jail and eventually the end of apartheid. That wasn't easy. That's never been forgotten by the South Africans. I was in South Africa at the time of the funeral for Nelson Mandela, and I'm telling you, Brian Mulroney was welcomed in South Africa as a hero.
You, of course, were there during the major political events for Brian Mulroney, including those 2 majority election wins, but you must have spent time with him away from the camera as a journalist. And I just wonder what you can tell us about Brian Mulroney as a person.
Well, the way he appeared sometimes on television was not the way you saw him in real life. He was a funny guy. He was he liked to kid around with journalists, and sometimes that bit him in the back because some journalists, respecting the rules of the game, reported some of the things he was saying, and that caused him problems. But he was a guy who never forgot his friends. I'll tell you a quick story. When his agriculture minister, John Wise, passed away, Mulroney was in China, not as prime minister. This is in his post-political days. I reached out to let him know because both he and I knew John Wise separately. And I wanted him to know that his minister had passed away. He arranged with the minister of the church that was conducting the funeral to have a call from him piped in without anybody else knowing in the church. Only the minister knew. And he regaled the audience in the way only Mulroney could with stories about John Wise. That's the kind of guy he was. He never forgot a friend. He never forgot a political ally. And he never forgot some of his political enemies either, reaching out and making friends with them over time. So listen, this was a guy who I said, you just have to mention the word Airbus, and people will know that there were problems on the Mulroney side too. But there were major accomplishments, and those shouldn't be forgotten in a guy who was on the landscape, political landscape of this country for a long time.
Peter, appreciate your recollections of the former Prime Minister, Brian Mulroney. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Take care.